It began not with the sound of artillery, but with silence. In the early hours of August 6, 2024, Ukrainian forces crossed an invisible line, the Russian border at Kursk Oblast, in what would become the most audacious military gambit of the entire war. No formal declaration, no televised warning, just armored columns moving through undefended tree lines into sovereign Russian territory for the first time since the Second World War. The Kremlin's border defenses, stripped thin by years of prioritizing offensive operations in eastern Ukraine, had almost nothing waiting for them. Within days, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed the capture of Sudzha, a town just 10 kilometers from the crossing point. The psychological shockwave that rippled through Moscow was not just about territory. It was about the fundamental illusion that the war would always remain on Ukrainian soil. Vladimir Putin had spent years constructing an iron narrative at home that Russia was conducting a special military operation, that it was winning, that the West was exhausted, that Ukraine was crumbling. The Kursk incursion shattered that story in a single week. Ukrainian forces seized over 250 square kilometers of Russian land. And despite Putin issuing repeated deadlines throughout the autumn of 2024 to expel them, the Ukrainian salient held into the new year. By the time Russian forces finally began recovering significant ground, it had cost them months of diverted manpower and attention. Troops and equipment pulled from the very eastern front where Putin's generals had been grinding forward in Donetsk. The trade was a calculated Ukrainian gamble. Sacrifice territory in the east, buy time, buy attention, buy doubt. And for a crucial period, it worked. But pressure has a way of compounding. By early 2025, Russian forces had reestablished momentum in the Donetsk corridor, and Putin entered the spring with what he believed were the pieces in place for a decisive campaign season. In March 2025, he declared with characteristic certainty that there are reasons to believe we can finish off Ukrainian forces. The Kremlin's planning was ambitious: drive deep into Sumy Oblast, apply pressure on Kharkiv, and break the psychological and logistical spine of Ukrainian resistance once and for all. This was to be the offensive that ended the war on Russian terms before international negotiations could crystallize into something less than total Ukrainian capitulation. The generals briefed, the troop concentrations were built, and then the spring offensive began. What followed was not a breakthrough, it was a bloodletting. By September 2025, after months of brutal fighting that consumed human lives at a rate almost without modern precedent, Russian forces had achieved none of their primary strategic objectives. Sumy remained Ukrainian. Kharkiv remained Ukrainian. The front lines had not shattered. The city of Pokrovsk, an obsession of the Russian advance in Donetsk, continued to resist. And when Russian troops finally entered its outskirts in late October, they found themselves swallowed by exactly the kind of grinding urban warfare that had already turned Bakhmut and Avdiivka into graveyards. According to estimates from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Russian forces suffered approximately 415,000 casualties in 2025 alone, an average of nearly 35,000 per month. Since February 2022, total Russian battlefield casualties had climbed toward 1.2 million. To find a comparable toll, military historians have had to reach back to the Second World War. The arithmetic of this offensive is damning. The Economist, drawing on data from more than 200 independent sources, published an assessment in October 2025 that cut through the Kremlin's triumphalism with cold precision. Despite the declared spring offensive and the enormous losses endured in pursuit of it, Russia had seized approximately 0.4% of Ukraine's territory between January and October of that year. Ukrainian forces had, in that same period, eliminated at least 100,000 Russian soldiers. For each kilometer of muddy Ukrainian ground absorbed into Russian occupation, thousands of men had been left on the battlefield. It was not a military campaign. It was a consumption event, Russia feeding its own army into a strategic nowhere in exchange for incremental gains measured in meters per day. CSS analysts noted that at current rates of advance, between 15 and 70 meters per day in the most active sectors, this ranked as one of the slowest offensive campaigns in any major war in the past century. The cost was not only measured in lives. Russia's war economy, already straining under the weight of Western sanctions, had entered a phase of visible deterioration by mid-2025. Economic growth slowed to 0.6%, barely measurable. Manufacturing output declined. Russia counted 0 companies in the global top 100 by market capitalization, not one. The fuel crisis that began emerging in Crimea and the southern regions was particularly revealing. Ukraine had launched a systematic campaign against Russian petroleum infrastructure, striking 10 oil refineries by late August 2025 and disrupting an estimated 17% of Russia's refinery capacity, roughly 1.1 million barrels per day. By September, the International Energy Agency reported that Russian revenues from oil product exports had declined to 5-year lows. Putin, acknowledging the pressure with unusual directness, pointed to Russia's coal reserves as an offset. It was an admission dressed as a plan. What made this collapse more insidious was the structure of self-deception that surrounded it. In December 2025, the Financial Times reported, based on 2 officials with direct knowledge of the system, that Russian military and security authorities were regularly delivering battlefield briefings to Putin that inflated Ukrainian casualties, downplayed tactical failures, and painted a consistently rosier picture than reality warranted. General Valery Gerasimov, chief of the Russian General Staff, was identified as responsible for these briefings. The portrait that emerged was of a commander-in-chief receiving curated intelligence from subordinates, too afraid of consequences to deliver honest assessments. Putin had, in this reading, been constructing his theory of inevitable victory not only on propaganda directed outward, but on fabricated reports flowing inward. He was, in effect, deceiving himself through the very apparatus of his own command. The consequences were observable. Putin visited a Russian military command post in late November 2025, clad in military fatigues, where commanders presented him with maps showing claimed advances on Kupiansk and near total control of Pokrovsk. Both assertions contradicted by independent open-source analysts tracking the front lines in real time. He awarded medals. He delivered speeches. He declared that Russian forces were advancing practically on the enemy's shoulders. Meanwhile, in Pokrovsk itself, Ukrainian Brigadier General Yevhen Lisichuk reported that Ukrainian forces had actually retaken areas on the western outskirts of the city in local counterattacks as Russian troops became bogged down in street-by-street combat. The gap between the Kremlin's declared reality and the battlefield's actual reality had grown so wide that they barely resembled the same war. The geopolitical dimensions only deepened the pressure. In August 2025, an Alaska summit between Russian and American delegations had produced what the Kremlin described as an understanding, a framework it now invoked as the only acceptable basis for any peace agreement. Russia's foreign ministry rejected a 20-point Ukrainian peace proposal presented in December as differing radically from Moscow's requirements. The Kremlin's negotiating position, maintained with remarkable consistency, was that Russia's territorial gains should be recognized, NATO expansion eastward should be reversed, and Ukraine should accept a form of permanent neutrality. These were not compromise positions. They were the demands of a side that still believed or needed to project that it believed it was winning. The math suggested otherwise. By early 2026, the coalition of Western nations supporting Ukraine had realigned. French President Emmanuel Macron announced that a coalition of 34 countries, coordinated without American leadership, was providing all international military support to Ukraine, with France alone supplying 2/3 of the military intelligence reaching Kiev. The United States, under domestic political pressure, had threatened to cut intelligence sharing to lever Ukraine toward negotiations, but the European coalition had moved to fill that gap. Russia had attempted for 3 years to break Western unity, counting on fatigue, on elections, on the weight of economic disruption. Instead, it found the coalition adapting around it. The most chilling dimension of the spring offensive's failure is not what it cost Russia in men and machines. It is what it revealed about the nature of the decision-making at the center of this war. Putin entered 2025 with a thesis that Russia could absorb casualties at a rate Ukraine could not match, that the West would eventually fracture, and that time was on his side. In March, he declared the conditions right for a final push. By autumn, 15,000 more Russian casualties had been added to the ledger. The economy had slowed, fuel was running short in occupied territories, and not a single major strategic objective had been achieved. According to one polling analysis cited by CSIS, the internal mood within Russia had shifted dramatically. By October 2025, 55% of Russians believed that most people in their social circles opposed the war, compared to only 39% in 2023. The war Putin had sold as swift and inevitable had become something else entirely. A burden, a wound, and increasingly a question no one in the Kremlin could answer without looking away. History has a way of arriving disguised as routine. What began as a silent border crossing in Kursk, a breach that Putin dismissed, then scrambled to contain, then claimed to have resolved, opened a fault line that his spring offensive could not close. Every attempt to force a military conclusion deepened the structural failure. Every exaggerated battlefield report moved him further from the reality his generals were unwilling to deliver. By the time 2026 opened, Russia had seized 4,131 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory in the entirety of 2025, approximately 0.8% of Ukraine's total landmass, in exchange for a year of catastrophic human and economic loss. The spring offensive that was meant to end the war had not ended it. It had only made the ending more distant, more expensive, and for Vladimir Putin, more dangerous to contemplate.